The White House ballroom smelled like fresh polish and cut flowers. It was 1963, and a young officer's wife stood at the edge of the receiving line in a dress she'd pressed twice that morning, just to be sure. Beside her, her husband straightened his jacket, glanced at her, and leaned in close enough that only she could hear him. "Don't embarrass me tonight." She nodded, the way wives of that era were taught to nod. Quiet. Agreeable. Small. 40 minutes later, a four-star admiral crossed that same ballroom, walked past 3 generals, past a senator, past her husband entirely, and stopped in front of her. "Colonel Harper," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor." Her husband's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. To understand why that single sentence, "Colonel Harper," landed like a thunderclap, you have to understand what a military marriage looked like in the early 1960s. This was a world of strict hierarchy, both in uniform and at home. An officer's career was often treated as a family project. Wives attended teas, organized officers' club luncheons, and were quietly, constantly evaluated. Their poise, their hospitality, even their handwriting on thank-you notes, as a reflection of their husband's fitness for promotion. Duty stations came with unspoken rules. A wife's job was to support, to smile, to never ask too many questions about the work. And for women who did have security clearances of their own, and there were more of them than most people today realize, that silence wasn't a preference. It was the law. The 1950s and early 60s saw a quiet expansion of women into classified logistics, communications, and intelligence roles, especially as Cold War tensions demanded operations run with surgical precision. These women signed documents that legally bound them to say nothing. Not to friends, not to family, not to husbands. So when Colonel Ethan Harper whispered his warning that night, he believed he understood his wife completely. He had no idea that the woman beside him had spent 6 years living a second life he knew nothing about. Lauren Harper had married Ethan in 1955, back when he was a lieutenant with an easy laugh and big plans. In those early years, she'd followed him from Fort Benning to Fort Bragg to a 2-year posting in West Germany, doing what officers' wives did, hosting dinners, keeping the household books, writing careful letters home on onion skin paper. But somewhere along the way, promotion changed him. Each new set of silver oak leaves, each new row of ribbons, seemed to add another layer of armor, and another inch of distance between them. By 1961, Ethan spoke more about protocol than about people. He corrected her use of titles at dinner parties. He reminded her, more than once, which general's wife outranked which. Any ability to track 100 moving variables, fuel, weather, personnel, timing, without ever losing the thread. She signed her clearance papers in a windowless room with no ceremony at all. Just a pen, a stack of forms, and a stern reminder. This conversation never happened. There's a detail people often get wrong about women like Lauren. They assume the secrecy was a kind of betrayal. It wasn't. It was survival for the mission and for the people depending on it. Historians who've studied Cold War-era logistics networks point to a striking fact. Some of the most consequential planning of the early 1960s was handled not by combat officers, but by an unglamorous corps of coordinators, many of them women, whose names never appeared in press releases. Their work simply worked, silently, and that silence was the whole point. Lauren carried that silence home every evening. She'd hang her coat, ask Ethan about his day, listen to him describe meetings and inspections in exhaustive detail, and then quietly set aside the truth that she, too, had spent the day making decisions that could alter the fate of an entire operation. She never resented the silence. What she began to resent, slowly and painfully, was that Ethan never once asked what filled her days. Not out of suspicion. Out of simple, corrosive lack of curiosity. By the time they were packing for Washington in the fall of 1963, an invitation to a White House ceremony honoring outstanding contributions to national logistics and readiness, Ethan assumed the invitation was his, a reward, finally, for his years climbing the ranks. He'd told 2 colleagues, offhandedly, that he expected to be recognized that evening. He never once asked why her name was printed on the formal invitation card, just above his own. The night of the ceremony, Lauren stood in front of the mirror in their hotel room, smoothing the same navy dress she'd worn to 3 other formal dinners. Ethan checked his medals in the reflection beside her, adjusting one a fraction of an inch. "This is a big night," he said. "Try not to wander off talking to the other wives. Stay near me. Don't embarrass me." She said nothing. She'd learned, over 8 years, which battles were worth fighting and which were simply small cruelties to absorb and carry quietly, the way she carried everything else. They arrived at the East Wing gate a few minutes before 7. A young aide checked names against a clipboard, and for one brief moment, Lauren felt the familiar flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with her marriage and everything to do with what she suspected, but had never been told outright, this evening might actually be about. Inside, the ballroom was already filling with gold braid and formal gowns. Ethan guided Lauren toward a cluster of officers he recognized, already rehearsing, in his mind, the modest way he'd accept congratulations he hadn't yet earned. That's when the room seemed to shift. A 4-star admiral, a man Ethan had only ever seen from a respectful distance at briefings, crossed the floor with unmistakable purpose. He passed 2 generals without breaking stride. He walked directly to Lauren, took her hand warmly, and said the words that would end one version of their marriage and, eventually, begin a better one. "Colonel Harper, it's an honor to finally meet the woman behind Operation Clearwater." Ethan's champagne glass hovered, forgotten, in his hand. The admiral turned to him with polite recognition. "Colonel Ethan Harper, I presume," shook his hand briefly, and then, without a trace of malice, simply escorted Lauren toward the front of the room, where several of the nation's most senior officers were already seated. Ethan stood alone for a long moment among strangers, holding a glass of champagne he no longer wanted to drink. The ceremony that followed unfolded like something out of a dream Lauren had never allowed herself to have. The president spoke of a classified, multi-service operation from 2 years prior, a logistics and evacuation effort that had quietly prevented what could have become a catastrophic humanitarian crisis involving American personnel stationed overseas. He described, in careful, unclassified language, a coordinator who had tracked hundreds of shifting variables across air, sea, and ground units, rerouting supplies and personnel in real time when the original plan collapsed within the first 6 hours. Thousands of American service members and civilians, he said, were alive today because one officer refused to let the operation fail. Then he said her name, Colonel Lauren Harper. She rose, walked to the podium in low heels that had seen 3 duty stations, and did the only thing that felt true to who she was. She thanked the medics, the pilots, the mechanics, the young enlisted men who'd worked 20-hour shifts without complaint, and the fellow logisticians whose names, she said, deserved far more recognition than hers. "I was only ever one piece of a much larger machine," she told the room. "The honor belongs to everyone who kept that machine running when it would have been easier to stop." Ethan watched from his seat, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about rank at all. They didn't speak until they were back in the hotel room, the metal box sitting unopened on the dresser between them like something neither one knew how to touch. Ethan finally broke the silence. 6 years, he said quietly. 6 years, and I never asked. "You couldn't have known," Lauren said. "I wasn't allowed to tell you." "That's not really the problem, is it?" he said. It wasn't a question. She sat down across from him. "No," she admitted gently. "The clearance kept me from telling you the details. But you stopped asking long before the secrecy ever became the obstacle. You stopped being curious about me a long time ago, Ethan." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he finally hears something true that he's spent years avoiding. In the weeks that followed, Ethan made a decision few officers of his generation ever made voluntarily. He stepped back from a command track he'd chased for a decade, choosing instead a quieter administrative post, not as punishment, he'd later say, but as a chance to rebuild the parts of himself he'd let atrophy while he was busy collecting rank. Lauren, meanwhile, accepted an invitation to help train the next generation of Army logistics officers, teaching young lieutenants, many of them women, that leadership was measured in reliability and respect, not in applause. There's a reason this story still resonates more than 60 years later. Almost everyone, at some point, has stood beside someone they love and felt invisible, not because that person meant to erase them, but because familiarity so easily curdles into assumption. We stop asking. We stop wondering. We decide we already know the whole story of the person across the table from us. Lauren Harper's silence wasn't a betrayal. It was a burden she carried with grace for years, because the mission demanded it. But the deeper lesson isn't about classified operations or four-star admirals. It's about the quiet cost of not asking and the quiet dignity of people who do extraordinary things without ever needing to be seen doing them. Somewhere in nearly every family from that era, there was a Lauren, a mother, a wife, a sister, whose full contribution was never fully known by the people closest to her, not because she hid it out of pride, but because no one ever thought to ask. And there was often an Ethan too, not a villain, just a man swept up in the noise of ambition, who eventually had to relearn how to truly see the person beside him. That, in the end, is the real medal in this story. Not the one in the velvet box. The one that comes from finally, honestly seeing someone. If this story stirred a memory, a parent, a grandparent, someone in your own family who carried a quiet weight nobody ever knew about, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. These are the stories worth remembering together. And if you'd like more true-to-the-era stories like this one, consider staying a while longer. There are more waiting for you.